listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond, Lisa Watson on the buttons. Joining us on the line, Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Gerald Horne is the John and J. Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He has a couple of new books out, Acknowledging Radical Histories, and he has another book out called I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne reader, and we are definitely looking forward to his visit to Leimert Park on February the 3rd. My cousin Donald told me he would be there with his red suit on to see you, and we'd like to welcome you to Diasporic Music, sir. How are you doing?
Hey, it's all good. How about you?
And Sam Cooke will say, wonderful.
Yeah.
We're going to let Melinda kick it off.
Yeah, so let's start with Wang Yi in Africa.
Well, Wang Yi is the Chinese foreign minister. Also, as you probably know, China, for a number of years now, has begun each calendar year with the foreign minister touring Africa. And Wang Yi continued that tradition. He journeyed to Egypt, and needless to say, the question of the war in Gaza or on Gaza is high on the agenda. He also journeyed to Togo, which is off the beaten track for many major powers, but obviously not for the People's Republic of China. And as listeners to this program probably know, there is a kind of contestation between China and the North Atlantic powers on the African continent. That is to say that the Africans are straining to break loose from neo-colonialism. China is also in accord with this desire, and therefore there is a confluence of interests between China and many African countries. However, as you also probably know, there is a tad of confusion with regard to the Chinese role, and also there's a tad of confusion, I'm afraid to say, with regard to the African role. And if you don't mind, allow me to segue into what we discussed last week, which is this remarkable suit brought by South Africa against Israel in the International Court of Justice pursuant to the Genocide Convention. Now, what's even more remarkable is what has transpired since that argument took place about a week or so ago. And that is that South Africa has joined to this lawsuit as aiders and abettors the regimes in Washington and in London. This is profound. And I should also say, in the interest of full disclosure, is that thus far unsuccessfully, I've been trying to organize an effort in the legal community and in the activist community to join the South African effort at the International Court of Justice, either by filing a kind of friend of the court brief on behalf of descendants of enslaved Africans in North America, pointing to our plight as evidentiary of what should be obvious, which is that Washington and London have had a history of either aiding and abetting genocide or perpetrating genocide itself. I haven't been able, to be frank, to round up an international lawyer to file this brief. So if push comes to shove, I may have to drop some of my present duties and
do it yourself.
Do it myself, which I would prefer not to do. But this points to another issue, which is that one would think, from all the bluster and the rhetoric, that when an African nation brings Washington and London into the dock along with Israel, that they would be celebrating. They would be saying, right on. But somehow I don't seem to get that feeling that that's what's really happening, at least from what I have been able to ascertain. I think part of it has to do with the point that early on, a kind of negative evaluation of the South African regime descended, and it makes it difficult for some to understand when South Africa embarks on this trailblazing path. But in any case, I take my hat off to Pretoria. It's remarkable what they're trying to do. And we should also realize that the North Atlantic powers, Washington, London, Israel, will not be resting silent as this unfolds. I dare say that they'll have some dirty tricks up their sleeves to spring on the South Africans. And I trust and I hope that our community will not fall for it. Because if you step back for a second and look at Southern Africa from 30,000 feet, you'll recall that when the government of Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe sought land reform to redistribute land from the European invaders to the African majority, he did not necessarily get support on this side of the Atlantic for various reasons. And in fact, some of the same people who were criticizing Mugabe because I guess they thought he was moving too rapidly, they then were criticizing South Africa with regard to moving too slowly concerning redistribution of wealth and power. So I guess the Southern Africans say, you know, we can't please these Negroes in North America, so we shouldn't even try.
You know, I remember the late General Gordon Baker Jr. always talked about, he bigged up Chris Hani, Henry Gwala. I think he was from the Natal province, if I'm not mistaken, if I'm not getting too old and forgetting too much. And Winnie Mandela should have received the support at that particular time, because you know in the ANC, some people felt that the ANC was moving too slowly, but Gwala, Winnie, and Chris Hani were on the right pack. I think on the right path. I think they were still inside they always were inside the ANC. But is there any truth to that statement?
Well, I agree with it in part, particularly with regard to Chris Hani. Recall that he was the head of the South African Communist Party, oftentimes viewed as a successor to Nelson Mandela, assassinated by a Polish immigrant, tragically, before 1994. And then Harry Gwala, I recall him very well, oftentimes described in the press as the diabetic, chain-smoking amputee who was also a South African communist who was quite militant, to put it mildly. As for
yes.
Comrade Winnie, I'm not so sure. I mean, Winnie had these lumpen tendencies. And just to piggyback upon your talking about my appearance in Los Angeles on February 3rd in Africa Town, Leimert Park, where I'll be previewing, as you know, the book I'll publish this summer, Armed Struggle, ? Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals, Southern California through the 60s and 70s. I have a lot to say in that text about the lumpen, because in part, as I tell the story, I think that many Black people, or young Black men in particular, were attracted to this concept of the lumpen because they saw them as a class who were rebellious, as one Panther put it. They were more willing to punch the boss than punch the clock, as he put it. But the lumpen, they had these tendencies towards indiscipline, towards thuggery, towards, and of course, in terms of what we're talking about when we talk about the lumpen. We're not talking about the reserve army of labor. We're not talking about the unemployed. We're oftentimes talking about people who are preying upon the working class, such as pimps. And I find it evidentiary that the term pimp nowadays is not necessarily seen as
negative.
As negative. I mean, it's become an all-purpose term. It's a noun, it's a verb, it's an adjective. I mean, and that's reflective of the influence of the lumpen. And as I said, it hasn't really been critiqued sufficiently, although I try to do so in this upcoming book. And Comrade Winnie, you know that she had these ties to, it was called the Mandela Football Gang, which was basically sort of a group of young toughs. And of course, she almost went to jail because they killed a person who they suspected, who not necessarily was guilty of anything. So I say right on to late Comrade Chris Hani, late Comrade Harry Gwala. I'm not so sure about Comrade Winnie.
I'm sorry for cutting you off. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I used to debate with my mother. I am not as hard on Winnie as you. And my mother was. My mother. We used to have. I was very respectful to Mud Deer, but we had some fights about Winnie. Boy, she talked about Winnie. She said, boy, that boy, Winnie killed that boy Stompy, bop, bop, boom, boom, boom. Oh, she didn't take any prisoners on. She wasn't a fan of Winnie at all. My goodness.
And plus,
but let me say this. I cut you off. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Go, you got the floor.
Well, but I don't know if could we say that Al Prentice Bunchy Carter was a lumpen? His mother, Nola Mae Carter, who was born in right outside of Shreveport, Louisiana, had gone to graduated from high school. She worked all of her life, and she was a working class woman, and she had I think maybe 8 kids. But how would we put Bunchy as a lumpen? You're saying he's a lumpen himself, and his mother was working class. I'm not debating what you're saying. I'm just trying to get some clarity.
Well, I would say this further with regard to clarity. Just because one comes from the working class does not necessarily mean one is going to be progressive. I mean, that's the problem we're having right now in the United States, because with regard to the left and the Trump base and the prospect of impending fascism, you have many folks, including the otherwise progressive filmmaker Michael Moore, who've been making excuses for the Trump base because he sees them as working class. Now, of course, he doesn't make the distinction of trying to figure out why there are few people from the black working class that are supporting Trump. I guess that's beyond his imagination. And there's this real tendency in the United States to say, oh, okay, Trump has working class support, then we got to support Trump. I mean, really, I kid you not. And I see this particularly outside of the United States, I must say, with people analyzing U.S. politics, and they're so turned off by Mr. Biden. So just because one is a lumpen doesn't necessarily mean one is going to be regressive or negative. And in any case, you have various strata of lumpen. I mean, for example, these mob families, John Gotti, you notice that the Negroes oftentimes take the surname.
Yes, sir. Right.
Gotti, Capone, especially rappers, they like to take those surnames because they want to emulate the big lumpen. They want to be sort of parasitic on the host body with regard to drug dealing and other measures that don't necessarily benefit the working class. But then, of course, you can, if you look in my reader, I dare say, I have an article about this that I wrote when I was in Zimbabwe, in fact, decades ago. And I point out that historically, you had the lumpen in Indonesia and in Angola. many within the lumpen playing progressive roles. It's just that structurally, it's not easy for a lumpen element to play a progressive role because, generally speaking, they play a parasitic role. Just like workers, as we know from Politics 101, have an antagonistic contradiction with the capitalists, just like tenants have an antagonistic contradiction with landlords. There is not much that unifies a landlord and a tenant. The landlord wants more rent money. The tenant wants to pay less rent money. There's an antagonistic contradiction. And so I think this brings me to another point that I'm making in this book, which is that I think that with all the Panthers' reading of Fanon and Lenin and Marx, which they definitely did, and Nkrumah, C.L.R. James, etc., the problem with them is not that they did not have that framework. They had the framework. The problem was they weren't necessarily following events from day to day. And that's the flesh on the bones. Now, to an extent that it was understandable, because many of these guys and women were in prison. And so it's difficult to follow events from day to day when you're in an iron cage. But once again, that is a structural problem.
Mm-hmm. George Jackson's father was a working class guy. When I used to see him doing interviews, I would really feel sorry for him because he really looked like he was the opposite of his mother. George Jackson's wife, Georgia Jackson, was a fire spitter. She came across like Queen Nzinga or someone. She was. I wouldn't want to be in any kind of confrontation with her, verbal or otherwise. Whereas George's father was he was mild and meek. You've seen interviews with George's father? He was a very working class. A serious working class brother.
Postal worker, which of course in the United States, the postal workers are dominated by Black workers in particular. Now,
right.
In my book, I cover Lester Jackson and Georgia Jackson. Let me say that for those who want further insight into Georgia Jackson, I did not include this in my book because for various reasons, but there is a biography of Faye Stender, who was a lawyer for Huey Newton, a lawyer for George Jackson, a lawyer for the Panthers in general. She was shot in her home by members of the Black guerrilla family and was paralyzed, subsequently became depressed, and subsequently committed suicide. Now, I mentioned this in this context because the author of this book, biography of Faye Stender, the biography is called Call Me Phaedra, Phaedra. It's very interesting. It's very well researched. I can't recall the author's name, but Call Me Phaedra. She intimates that Georgia Jackson was involved in that tragedy.
Mm-hmm. A lot of the stuff that we're talking about, I'm definitely not going on the record of saying anything about that. I don't know anything about it, and in terms of struggle, there's a lot of stuff that goes on in struggle that. Let me say this: I used to sit in meetings sometimes, and I won't even mention the city. People would have a meeting, and they would have a match, and they would write what they were saying, and then burn it up. That is some of the people that I was around were pretty advanced in terms of not letting the cat out of the bag, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that there's a problem with. I think it was George Jackson that talked about a Chinese comrade was telling him about Black Americans. He says he loved the Black Americans, their spirit, they're this, but they say have one problem: talky. You talk too much, you know.
Well, here's an example of that. One of the points that I make in this book is that if you're going to launch armed struggle against the United States of America, you may not want to openly discuss it until you have cadre in place, you have your rear base in place, etc. But these folks, they were broadcasting it even before they were sufficiently organized. And see, by way of contrast, another thing that I point out is that you had communists who were trained in Moscow in the 1930s in guerrilla warfare. But that was not necessarily broadcast all over the place. The downside to that is that the Panthers thought that they were inventing the wheel, you know, when they thought about this bright idea. Because the communists tended to be rather tight-lipped, understandably, because you're going to broadcast to the U.S. ruling class that you're training people in guerrilla warfare. I mean, come on. So anyway, look for the book, July 2024.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. Linda Francis, Norman Richmond, and you are an elections man. Now there are elections that are taking place in many places. Could we begin with Taiwan?
Yeah, well, it wasn't good news. The DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, so-called, a party of secession from the People's Republic of China, Taiwan being the teardrop-shaped island off the southern coast of China, population of 23 million compared to China's 1.3, 1.4 billion. The DPP won the presidency. Their majority in the parliament declined. But this is going to worsen tensions between People's Republic of China and U.S. imperialism, perhaps even Canadian imperialism, because the United States, although it won't admit it, would like to establish a kind of rear base or a military base on Taiwan from which they could threaten People's Republic of China. The People's Republic of China obviously is hotly opposed to that. U.S. imperialism feels that with every passing day, it's losing the advantage. That is to say that they have a military advantage as we speak, but that military advantage is declining. As a person who reads China Daily on a regular basis, on the front page just a few days ago, there was an article about how China has just entered the shipbuilding industry in a big time way. Not only cruise ships, but oil tankers, natural gas tankers, not to mention aircraft carriers. Well, they got aircraft carriers actually from the former Soviet Union, but they're building aircraft carriers. And of course, they're also in the process of building commercial jets that will challenge both Boeing and Airbus. On the front page, on the front cover, of The Economist, the British conservative weekly, one of the newsstands now, there's a scare article meant to scare the North Atlantic elite about the influx of Chinese electric vehicles into the United States. China is now already, as of 2023, the major auto exporter on planet Earth, surpassing both Japan and Germany. One of the reasons why Germany is in the ditch, that is to say its economy, is because Chinese auto exporters are cleaning the clock of BMW, Volkswagen, and Mercedes, to name a few. So there's a lot of hysteria, and I would say understandable hysteria, about the rise of China right now. And the hawks in the North Atlantic community feel that with every passing day, China's economy is growing, imperialism is falling behind, so time is not on their side.
And what about Argentina? That's a hot item, wouldn't you say? The elections.
Argentina is committing slow motion suicide. Now, to be fair, there's going to be a big demonstration this coming week in Buenos Aires, and it'll be interesting to see how many people turn up and what the impact will be on the newly installed President Milei, who is a so-called anarco-capitalist. He got an invitation, that is to say his country got an invitation to join the BRICS. He slapped it aside. He's going to hitch his wagon to U.S. imperialism. As I've said before, I believe on this program, I think that there's a reason why a disproportionate percentage of the psychiatrists of the world are in Buenos Aires, because there's a real complex in Argentina about being considered so-called third world, about being next door to Brazil, a country with the largest Black population west of Nigeria, largest Black population in the hemisphere. And of course, there's this competition with Brazil, which is one of the reasons why President Milei turned down the invitation to join the BRICS. So I predicted before he was sworn in that President Milei, he will not serve out a full term. And I stand by that prediction. I think he'll be driven from office.
Can we move on to Ethiopia and Somalia?
Oh, my goodness. As if Africa does not have enough problems, as if Ethiopia does not have enough problems, given the conflict that we've discussed at length about Tigray province and the uprising there. What's happened is that Ethiopia, with the secession of Eritrea about 3 decades or so ago, has lost its ports abutting the Red Sea, for example. And it feels it has to pay through the nose to use the port in Djibouti, for example. So this brings us to the country that calls itself Somaliland. And I put it that way because technically it's part of the larger Somalia. But the Somaliland, so-called, was formerly British Somaliland, whereas Somalia was so-called Italian Somaliland. We all know what's happened in the larger Somalia with regard to the uprising, the revolt, Al-Shabaab, etc., and how that's been the case for about 3 decades or so. Somaliland has, in a sense, seceded from the larger Somalia, although Somalia does not accept that. But what happened is that Ethiopia has worked out a deal with Somaliland to get access to its ports. And in turn, Somaliland is taking an interest in Ethiopian Airways. And of course, you know from my book, Storming the Heavens, that Ethiopian Airways not only is the most sophisticated air carrier on continent of Africa, it's really a kind of Pan-African Airways, if you like. But it was initiated by Black Americans, including the late John Robinson from Mississippi via Chicago in the 1930s, when he traveled across the Atlantic to organize an air force to fight the Italian fascist invaders and defend the regime, and then went on to live there until he died in a plane crash in the 1950s, and thousands of Ethiopians turned out for his funeral. In any case, the larger Somalia is quite upset with Ethiopia. Do not be surprised if that internal conflict in Somalia is directed externally towards Ethiopia. And what I didn't think I finished my thought. Somaliland is taking an interest in Ethiopian Airways. That's part of the trade-off. And keep also in mind that the UAE, United Arab Emirates, is in on the deal because they're going to help to refurbish the port in Somaliland. And the UAE is playing an outsized role in Africa right now. I mean, all these Negroes who are complaining about China in Africa, they really should look at the UAE. Because if you look at neighboring Sudan, for example, they're all involved, that is to say the UAE, in the conflict between the military and the so-called rapid support forces, for example. They're involved in buying land in Africa to grow crops, or even leasing land to grow crops. But once again, somehow that's flown under the radar.
The last thing is the Raptors were beaten, I think, by 26 points by the New York by the something's wrong. Can you hear me, Gerald?
Loud and clear.
I think they call the show. The Raptors were beaten by the New York by 26 points. We can talk about that.
Actually, I want to talk about. There's a story to be told about Ontario in basketball, because the next new thing, the next great player in the NBA hails from Toronto. His mother is a track star, a former track star from Antigua Barbuda. His name is Shai G. Alexander, SGA, plays for Oklahoma City Thunder. He is fantastic. He's ambidextrous on the court. He can handle with both hands. He can shoot with both hands. And he lives in the off season in Ontario. I guess the question we need to discuss next week is, why is Ontario developing such great basketball players? But I think our time has expired.
And thank you very much. And we will see you until next week. Take care.